Welcome to Dark Horror Diaries, my friend. Before the show starts, do write below where are you from. Let's go. I took the job because I needed the money. After 4 years of scraping by in college, I was drowning in student loans and had no real career prospects. The ad was straightforward: live-in caretaker needed for elderly woman. Room, board, and competitive pay provided. I figured it was an easy gig. Keep an old woman company, maybe cook a few meals, and have time to figure out my life. The mansion, Whitford House, stood alone at the edge of town, past a stretch of forest that swallowed the road. The taxi driver who dropped me off wouldn't even go up the driveway, muttering something about bad history before speeding off. The place looked like something from another century. Tall, cold, and lifeless. The wraparound porch sagged slightly, and the windows were so dark I couldn't tell if anyone was inside. It wasn't abandoned, but it felt forgotten. Mrs. Evelyn Whitford was waiting for me in the parlor when I stepped in. She was small and brittle, wrapped in a thick shawl despite the summer heat. Her eyes followed me like she was memorizing my face. She didn't say much, just nodded when I introduced myself and gestured for me to sit. Then there was Gregory, the butler. He wasn't what I expected. He wasn't an old man in a suit. He was tall, gaunt, and unnervingly quiet, maybe in his late 50s, though something about him felt older. He barely acknowledged me as he led me through the house, pointing out my room, the kitchen, and Mrs. Whitford's quarters. He moved without sound, his shoes never making a single creak on the old wooden floors. That first night, I heard something in the attic. It wasn't mice. It wasn't the house settling. It was whispers. And Gregory was standing in the hallway, watching my door. The second day at Whitford House was worse. Mrs. Whitford barely acknowledged me. She sat in her chair by the window, hands folded in her lap, her gaze lost somewhere beyond the trees. I tried to engage her, offered to read to her, asked if she needed anything. But all she did was shake her head slowly. Gregory, on the other hand, was everywhere. I'd turn a corner, and he'd be standing there. I'd enter a room, and he'd already be inside. He didn't say much beyond a few polite nods and uncomfortably direct stares. I started noticing small things. My belongings weren't where I left them. The bathroom door, which I swore I had closed, would be open when I returned. A draft of cold air slipped through the hallways even though the windows were shut tight. And then there was the attic door. It was the only door in the house that was locked. The handle was old brass, scratched and worn, with deep grooves in the wood beneath it, like someone had clawed at it. I asked Gregory about it at dinner. "What's in the attic?" I said, stabbing at my overcooked meat. He didn't even look up. "Storage." "Can I go up there?" "No." Silence stretched between us. Mrs. Whitford, who had barely touched her food, slowly turned her head toward me. Her pale lips twitched, and for the first time she spoke. "Do not go into the attic, Miss Hart, ever." Her voice was so weak I barely heard it, but there was something in it. Fear. I nodded, but my curiosity was already burning. That night, I lay awake, listening. At 2:47 a.m., the noises started. Faint at first. The scrape of something heavy moving above me. Then whispers, the same as before, growing louder like several voices speaking at once. I sat up, my breath shallow. The air in my room felt dense, pressing down on my chest. Then, just outside my door, footsteps, slow, deliberate. I gripped my blanket, heart hammering. The footsteps stopped. I knew someone was standing just beyond the wood, listening. I waited. The door never opened. But in the silence, I heard something worse. A quiet chuckle. And then the footsteps retreated. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks and groans of Whitford House shifting in the night. The whispers had stopped, but the memory of them lingered. Too many voices speaking at once. By morning, I had made a decision. I was going to find out what was in that attic. After breakfast, I started searching the house. Mrs. Whitford stayed in her chair by the window, and Gregory disappeared into whatever dark corner he lurked in during the day. That left me alone to explore. The mansion was old, but it had been beautiful once. Dusty chandeliers hung from high, carved ceilings. The library shelves stretched floor to ceiling, packed with books whose leather bindings had rotted away. Most of the furniture was covered with white sheets, like ghosts frozen in place. I checked the parlor, the study, even the basement, searching for a key to the attic. Nothing. Then I thought of Gregory. Where does he keep his keys? The answer came that afternoon when I caught him leaving the dining hall. A ring of brass and iron keys hung from his belt, tucked beneath his jacket. I needed those keys. I waited until evening. That night, I set my alarm for 1:30 a.m. The house was silent when I slipped out of my room. I moved carefully, barefoot to avoid making noise. Gregory's room was down the hall from mine. The door was slightly ajar. Careless. I took a deep breath and crept inside. His room was small. Too small for a man who had lived here his whole life. Just a simple bed, a wooden wardrobe, and a nightstand. No personal items, no pictures. But on the nightstand, sitting beside a single unlit candle, was the keyring. I grabbed it. Then I heard breathing. I froze. Gregory was asleep, lying rigid on his bed, his face turned toward the ceiling. His chest barely moved. He looked dead. I backed away. I made it to the door, my pulse hammering, when Gregory's voice, low, calm, and cold, stopped me. That door is locked for a reason, Miss Hart. I turned. He hadn't moved. His eyes were still closed, but he was smiling. I ran. Heart pounding, I sprinted down the hall, clutching the keys so tight they cut into my palm. I reached the attic door, shoved a key into the lock, and turned. The click echoed down the hallway. I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. Damp wood, rotting fabric, something sour and decayed. The attic was massive, stretching the entire length of the house. Moonlight filtered through a single round window, casting long shadows over old furniture, trunks, and something else. A row of iron cages. Each one lined the far wall, doors rusted shut. Inside, I saw piles of old clothes, bones half buried beneath dust, deep scratches gouged into the floorboards. I staggered back. That's when I saw it. A figure, slumped in the corner, barely breathing. A man. His skin was gray, his clothes shredded. His eyes fluttered open, sunken hollow. He tried to speak, but his voice came out a dry, cracked whisper. Run. Behind me, the attic door slammed shut. And then I heard Gregory's footsteps. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. The attic door was closed, but I hadn't touched it. Gregory's footsteps echoed on the stairs, slow and deliberate, like a judge approaching the gallows. I had seconds to move. I darted behind an old wardrobe, pressing myself into the shadows. My pulse pounded in my ears as I heard the creak of the attic door opening again. Gregory stepped inside. Miss Hart, his voice was calm, patient. You should not be here. I held my breath. The man in the corner, the prisoner, let out a ragged breath. His eyes, dull and sunken, flickered toward me. He tried to speak again, but only a dry rasp came out. Gregory took a step further inside. I have been very lenient, he continued, tone smooth. Too smooth. The others, they did not get this chance. Others. The words sent a chill down my spine. The prisoner managed one word, hoarse and broken. Run. I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I whispered, Who are you? His breathing hitched. His throat worked like it hurt to form words, but after a long, painful moment, he spoke. William Cross. A shudder ran through him. I was the last one. A sharp intake of breath rattled in my chest. Last, caretaker, I guessed. He gave a weak nod. Before you. Gregory sighed. It is disappointing when they start to talk. I risked another glance at the cages. 6 in total. The iron was warped, rusted with age. Deep scratch marks lined the bars. Not from an animal, from people. This had been happening for years. Decades. You are wondering, I assume, why you are here, Gregory continued. He sounded amused. They all do. I clenched my fists. You kill them, I said. Not a question. Gregory chuckled softly. Not quite, he said. You misunderstand, Miss Hart. I do not kill them. The house does. Something deep inside me twisted. William tried to speak again, but his body sagged, too weak to keep going. Gregory sighed. It is tradition, he went on. A pact made long before my time. The Whitford bloodline. We built this house. It protects us. But it requires something in return. I swallowed hard. People. Not just any people, he corrected. Servants. Caretakers. Those who come here to serve. They are absorbed, and I remain. I stepped back. You're feeding off them. Gregory's face didn't change. It is not so crude. It is simply the way of things. I live, and they become part of the house. I barely held back a shudder. Why me? I whispered. Gregory tilted his head. Because you were foolish enough to come, he said simply. Something shifted in the attic. A deep, creaking groan. The house was moving. Gregory turned his eyes toward the ceiling. Ah, he murmured. It knows you now. I realized in that moment that the Whitford house was alive. My fingers tightened around the keys. There had to be a way out. William's breath came shallow. If I left him here, he would die. I could still hear the whispers, the voices of the others before me. Their bones were still in the cages. I wasn't going to join them. I took a deep breath. Then, before Gregory could react, I ran for the door. He moved fast. Too fast. But I was faster. I slammed it behind me and turned the key in the lock. Gregory pounded against the door, his voice eerily calm on the other side. You cannot escape, Miss Hart. But I was already racing down the stairs. I didn't have time. I needed to find a way to kill him, and fast. I hit the bottom of the attic stairs at full speed, nearly losing my footing as I sprinted down the hall. The house groaned. The walls felt closer, tighter, like they were breathing. Gregory was still upstairs, but he wouldn't stay locked up forever. I had minutes, maybe less. Mrs. Whitford's door was slightly ajar, and for the first time since I arrived, I saw something in her eyes. Not the usual blank stare, but fear. You knew, I said, stepping inside, my voice shaking. She didn't deny it. Her lips moved soundlessly, her frail hands gripping the blankets in her lap. She shook her head, not at me, but at something behind me. I turned. The hallway lights flickered. The attic door was open. Gregory was free. You should not have run, Miss Hart, Gregory called down the stairs. His footsteps were slow, measured. He was enjoying this. I turned back to Mrs. Whitford, desperate. How do I stop him? I pleaded. There has to be a way. Her eyes flickered toward the fireplace. The Whitford journals. I lunged for the books, shoving them open with trembling fingers. The pages were filled with old rituals, incantations, strange symbols. But one word stood out in jagged, inked scrawl. Bound to the house. I scanned the page, breath catching in my throat. He wasn't just bound to the house. He was part of it. I looked at the fireplace, then at the massive wooden beams supporting the house. If I couldn't kill him, maybe I could destroy the house. A sharp crack above made me flinch. Gregory was on the landing now, his dark silhouette looming over the railing. You cannot win, Miss Hart, he said. I shoved the journal into my coat and ran. The hallway seemed longer. The house was shifting, stretching. The doors disappeared as I passed them. The stairs groaned under my feet like they were about to give way. But I didn't stop. I ran for the basement. If the house was alive, I needed to kill it at the root. The basement door slammed shut behind me as I stumbled inside, gasping for air. It was cold, colder than it should have been. Candles lined the stone walls, their flames flickering wildly as if caught in an unseen wind. I barely noticed them, because in the center of the room was an altar, a ritual site. This was where it had started. I flipped open the journal, scanning for anything that looked like a reversal. My hands were shaking too badly to focus. Footsteps. Gregory was coming. I yanked down a shelf of old glass bottles, sending them shattering against the stone. A thick black liquid oozed out, coating the floor. It smelled rotten, ancient. The air rippled around me. The house was waking up. Gregory stepped into the doorway. His dark eyes gleamed. That book will not save you. I held it tighter. You're bound to the house, I said. If I destroy it. He smiled. A bold idea, he said, voice like silk. But you do not have the means. I took a step back. He was right. I couldn't just burn a house this size, but I could do something else. I grabbed one of the candles and threw it onto the black liquid. Flames erupted across the floor, climbing up the walls like living things. Gregory's smile finally faltered. The house screamed. The wooden beams groaned. The ceiling above us split. Gregory's expression darkened. He took a step forward, but for the first time, he hesitated. The fire wasn't just burning the house. It was burning him. Miss Hart, he said, voice less certain. You do not understand what you are doing. I grabbed a rusted iron rod from the floor and lunged. Gregory raised a hand to block me, but he was slower now. The flames were draining him, just like they had sustained him for years. I drove the iron straight through his chest. His body convulsed. For the first time since I'd met him, his expression changed. Not calm, not composed, but afraid. The walls trembled. Gregory screamed, and the house began to fall. The floor lurched beneath me as the fire consumed the basement, thick smoke curling up the crumbling walls. Gregory's body convulsed against the iron rod, his skin cracking like aged porcelain. The house was rejecting him. I stumbled back, coughing, my lungs burning as flames clawed toward the ceiling beams. Above me, I could hear the groans of the collapsing mansion. Gregory's dark eyes locked onto mine, his face frozen in something I could only describe as realization. Not anger, not malice, but the cold, hollow understanding that his time was finally up. A deep crack split the stone foundation, and the entire room lurched sideways. I had no choice but to run, vaulting over a fallen beam as the fire followed me, licking at my heels. Behind me, Gregory let out a single inhuman shriek, a sound that didn't belong in this world. Then the fire swallowed him whole. I barely made it to the stairs. The heat pressed against my back as I threw my weight against the basement door, stumbling into the main hall. The house was coming apart. The walls buckled, groaning like a dying beast. Chandeliers crashed from the ceiling. The paintings of the long-dead Whitfords blistered and peeled away as if their souls were finally escaping. I ran past the dining room, where Mrs. Whitford still sat, her frail form motionless. For a moment, I thought she was already dead. But then she smiled. The flames reflected in her glassy eyes, and her lips parted slightly, mouthing words I couldn't hear over the roaring fire. Then she closed her eyes. I didn't have time to think about what it meant. I ran. The front doors wouldn't budge. Of course they wouldn't. I grabbed a chair, hurling it at the nearest window. Glass shattered, and a blast of cold night air rushed inside, mixing with the suffocating heat. I climbed onto the ledge and jumped. My body hit the overgrown lawn hard, rolling across damp grass. I barely had time to register the impact before a deep, thunderous groan rattled the ground. I looked up just in time to see Whitford House collapse in on itself. The roof caved first, then the second floor, then the first. Like a dying animal curling into itself, the house imploded, dragging all its secrets, all its horrors, and whatever was left of Gregory down into the earth. A final gust of heat and ash blasted past me. Then silence. I sat up slowly, my body aching, my hands trembling. The house was gone. Nothing but embers remained, glowing faintly in the night. For a long time, I didn't move. I just sat there, staring at the smoldering ruins, half expecting something. Anything. To crawl from the wreckage. But nothing did. It was over. Then I heard it. A whisper. So faint, I almost thought I imagined it. Miss Hart. My blood ran cold. I turned, heart hammering. There was nothing behind me. Just the ruins of Whitford House, crumbling into the night. But I knew that voice. I would always know that voice. Gregory. Even in death, he wasn't finished. The fire department arrived at dawn. They had a lot of questions. I had no answers. The official report said the fire started from old, faulty wiring. An accident. They found no human remains in the rubble. No sign of Mrs. Whitford. No sign of Gregory. I left town the next day. 1. At first, I didn't think anything of it. My neighbor would stop to chat with me, leash in hand, and I would catch glimpses of the metal slider dangling from its belly. I assumed it was wearing a piece of pet clothing, or that perhaps it was the byproduct of some awkward veterinarian procedure. But the more we chatted and the more I saw this mystery zipper, the more I realized it was out of the ordinary, clearly embedded in the dog's skin. It drew my attention every time we engaged in small talk, until finally one day, I decided to ask about it. Say, what is that zipper for on the little guy's belly anyway? Oh, that. It's a long story. I wouldn't want to bore you. I've got nothing but time. I wondered if she could see the beads of sweat forming above my brow. Really, it's nothing, just a safety measure. And that was it. She pretty much laughed it off, granting me little in the way of an explanation. Thinking back, her responses were downright vague and deflective. She could see how curious I was, so why not just tell me? And what exactly did she mean by safety measure? As unfruitful as our conversation was, I didn't press the matter any further. Days, weeks, months went by. I would occasionally see the dog's strange cosmetic feature, but I brushed it off every time, knowing it would only haunt me if I dwelled on it. Still, the thought itched in the back of my mind. It wasn't until a few months had passed that I would finally have the nerve to scratch it. I was pulling up weeds along my fence when I looked over at my neighbor's place, noticing the dog lying on the back porch. A stray cat wandered by, as often happened in our neighborhood. Without so much as a warning growl or malicious stance, the dog trotted over to the cat and scarfed it down, the sound of sharp teeth colliding with bone. The cat screeched in agony until it was no more. In a minute flat, its entire body was devoured. I was in shock. The cat's cries alerted my neighbor to the situation. She raced outside, grabbed the dog by the collar, and pulled him into the house. Through the sliding door, it was tough to make out, but I swear she unzipped him and reached inside, seemingly adjusting one of his organs. He didn't flinch, not even a bit. After pulling her arm out, the dog dropped to the floor, dead as a doornail from the looks of it. She then carried him outside and placed him back on the porch, arranging him into a sleeping position before getting in her car and leaving for the day. This 5-minute span of visual information was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. Words like gruesome, strange, and horrific are too tame to describe what I saw. I was appalled beyond measure. After the shock wore off, I hopped the fence and approached the dog's carcass. I felt its neck, cold to the touch, no pulse. I looked to its underside, and there it was. That God-forsaken zipper in all of its mysterious glory. I felt kind of bad for the dog dying, but I had to know what that thing was there for. I needed an explanation for not only the dog's, but my neighbor's odd behavior just moments ago. I slowly unzipped the dog's belly, placating my curiosity with the satisfying sound of metal sliding across metal. I spread each side of the opening with my hands and peered in, divulging the animal's inner workings. What I saw was absolutely dumbfounding. My neighbor's dog was animatronic. I decided that my best course of action would be to call animal control. I could tell them my neighbor's dog trespassed on my lawn and was attacking the neighborhood cats. They would show up, examine the robotic carcass, and then go from there. I knew there wasn't a protocol for that sort of thing, but I assumed they could take care of things and contact the appropriate people, whether it be the police, the government, or the National Enquirer. As long as this weird predicament was taken care of, I could sleep easy, knowing that my neighbor's strange robot dog wasn't going around eating whatever it pleased. Simple, right? Nope. Far from it. Animal control took a while to get there. By the time they arrived, my neighbor had come home and disposed of the evidence, hiding the dog somewhere in her home. The animal control officer apologized for the misunderstanding and left, leaving my neighbor on her front porch, glaring in my direction. It appeared privacy meant nothing to the local authorities, just my luck. The days that followed were different. My neighbor's dog had sprung to life, reactivated by its master, no doubt. They would walk their usual path around the cul-de-sac, but would not stop for small talk. I knew her dirty little secret after all. I was no longer a friendly neighbor to be conversed with. Oh no, I was an enemy, a danger to this woman's unusual way of life. Even if I meant no harm to her or her strange choice of pet, she didn't seem to see it that way. She continued to give me the cold shoulder for about a month and a half before finally speaking with me again on one of her daily strolls. Hey there. Hello. Everything all right? Just peaky. I'm having a cookout on Saturday at noon. You're more than welcome to come. Strange. We weren't on speaking terms for over a month, and now I was suddenly invited over. Maybe this was her extending an olive branch my way, her way of saying, no hard feelings. Yeah, sure. I can make it. Sounds like a good time. Great. I'll add you to the list. As she walked away, I felt the need to apologize, even if her dog was a weird, cat-eating robot. Hey, about that animal control call, I just wanted to say, don't worry about it. Water under the bridge. See you Saturday. She hurried off home, and that was that. Problem solved. Or so I thought. The night before the cookout, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing what sounded like footsteps creeping around the perimeter of my house. Every time I got up to investigate, the sound ceased and the coast appeared to be clear. It was either a prank at my expense, a burglar taking their sweet time to pull the trigger, or ghosts roaming around in the night. Either way, it left me anxious, making sleep a distant dream, just out of my reach. During a particularly loud set of footsteps, I raced downstairs, just in time to catch 4 glowing dots peering in through my living room window. This was enough to make my neck hairs stand upright. Though terrified, I wasted no time grabbing a ball bat and storming out my front door to greet the would-be intruders. I may be old, but I can still kick some ass when needed, especially when it involves crossing my property line. To my astonishment, my yard was empty. I covered every side of the house, only to find no one, not a soul in sight in any direction I looked. I don't care how fast you can sprint. Nobody could have made it out of eyeshot in such a short period of time, even in those low-light conditions. Baffled, and even more anxious than before, I locked up every last door and window in my home before crawling under the covers like a frightened child, scared of the mystery figures lurking in the shadows. The footsteps dissipated over the course of the night, and as the sun came up over the horizon, so too did my fear. My waking nightmare had ended, but not before putting a weary, sleep-deprived frame of mind in its place. In a sluggish slur of movement, I grudgingly made my way to my neighbor's house around noon, ready as I would ever be for the neighborhood get-together. Oddly enough, there were no cars in the driveway, aside from her own. I wondered if I got the date wrong, but after knocking on the door, she greeted me with a smile and rushed me into the house. We exchanged pleasantries, and she sat me down at a bar stool in the kitchen. After a few moments of awkward silence, I mustered up the courage to ask about the elephant in the room. "So, where is everybody?" "You're already here, silly." I tilted my head, puzzled. "What about everyone else?" "There is no one else. You're the only person I invited." All at once, the pieces clicked into place. I felt stupid for not realizing it sooner. Her sudden kindness, the noises the night before. There was no cookout. There was never any cookout. I was in the middle of a trap, lured in largely due to my own idiocy. I should have guessed that something sinister was going on the moment I unzipped that dog. "So, what happens now?" I asked. "You'll see. Just sit tight." I quickly jumped up from my chair and turned towards the door. With inhuman speed, she bolted in front of me, a large kitchen knife in hand. Not so fast. I stood, still as stone, intimidated by her fluid motions and firm stance. "We need to talk." "About what?" I knew exactly what. Don't play dumb with me. And that's when I noticed it. On her chest, peeking through the top of her blouse. I would have missed it had the sunlight coming through the window not danced across its metal. She had a zipper too. The next few moments are a bit fuzzy, but I can only guess that I was knocked out or chloroformed as I awoke strapped to a chair in a new room. Given the staircase, I assumed I was in her basement, though this realization didn't help me any. I attempted to break free of my restraints, but it was no use. Unless she were to free me herself, I was fastened to that chair for life. In absence of mobility, I decided to give the place a once-over. The staircase was to my left and a concrete wall to my right, but directly in front of me was a workstation, complete with about a dozen computers. This is where my neighbor sat, a USB cord snaking out of her unzipped chest, typing away at a blinding rate. Her motives were still unclear to me. Though confined to the one view, I was able to turn my neck enough in both directions to form a decent picture of what was behind me. It was a wall of cages, each housing an identical copy of her dog. They didn't move, even in the slightest, likely just as animatronic as she was. What on God's green earth had I stumbled into? Just then, my neighbor ripped the cord from her chest and walked over to me. "Ah, good. You're awake. Did you have a nice nap?" I refused to reply, looking her up and down in disgust, trying to make out what this thing was that was speaking to me. "What's the matter? Dog got your tongue?" I remained silent, in lieu of her taunting me. "That's all right. You just need to listen. Sit tight. I'll be right back." She walked over to her workstation and grabbed something before reclaiming her spot in front of me. "I've worked too hard in this location to have you screwing things up on me. Then again, it's my own fault. I was careless. I never should have left my core on the porch like that." I assumed she was talking about the dog. "I want you to look at this." She placed the object at eye level. It was a badge of sorts, upon which was a logo that read Synthetic Tech. "I'm an android. I work for a large company, moving from location to location, gathering specific information that is crucial to our initiative. You can't know anything beyond that. Hell, you already know far too much." I hadn't noticed it at first, but she seemed to keep playing with her zipper. God, I am so sick of this meat suit. Before my very eyes, she removed her clothing and unzipped herself down to the groin. In the most unnatural way possible, she slid out of her own skin, revealing to me her true form. She was nothing but a pile of electronics, pieced together in human shape. It was a strange sight, nauseating in every sense of the word. The way she moved and spoke while like this was downright sickening. I can't say any more, but I want you to know that our work is necessary. If you were to speak these truths to the world above, you would be jeopardizing everything we've accomplished. You have to submit to our intentions and see that they are just. I didn't know what to make of this. I simply looked away, wishing not to see her grotesque animatronic face any longer. Unfortunately for me, she grabbed it and forced it in her direction anyway, the feeling of cold metal enveloping my jaw. You need to promise to me that you will submit. You are not to tell anyone of any of this. Do you understand? I nodded in agreement, but only because I wanted her hand off of my face. Luckily, she let go and backed away. Good. You know, we're not so bad when you get to know us. In a sense, we're just like you. Internally, I scoffed at the thought of this. I was nothing like her, and not just because of her appearance. I was never one to go around kidnapping my neighbors, holding them captive in my basement. It just wasn't my cup of tea. Well, this is it. I'll need you to take over from here. Don't make the same mistake I did, lest you regret it for the rest of your life. This was the last thing she said to me, though I had no idea what any of it meant. I must have been knocked unconscious again, because the next thing I remember was waking up on her basement floor, no longer bound by my restraints. For one reason or another, she didn't kill me. I was a free man. Without warning, a group of trained operatives burst through the basement door and raced down to help me up. Are you all right? Yes, I'm fine. What's going on? I noticed a few of the men walk on opposite sides of the room to gather evidence. One guy ripped open a cage, grabbed one of the dogs, and unzipped him, revealing it to be nothing but a hollow carcass. They're empty, sir. A collection of shells. Just as I suspected. No matter. Load them into the truck with the hard drives. Hopefully she didn't wipe them before she left. I must have looked completely bewildered, because the gentleman grabbed me by the shoulders and looked me straight in the eye. Everything's fine now. We've been on this woman's tail for a long time. We may not have captured her, but this is still a big win, and it's all thanks to you. I was still confused, but more so relieved that it was all over. Are you sure you're all right? Don't need a ride to the hospital. I shook my head, not wishing to be poked and prodded after what I'd endured. I didn't trust doctors much anyway. I just wanted to go home. Okay, let me walk you to your house. I agreed, and we were off. I couldn't wait to get inside and put the whole ordeal behind me. That was the plan anyway. Whatever government officials they were, the entire crew picked the place clean and left my neighborhood within a couple of hours. That night, I received a call from them for a statement regarding the situation. I obliged and asked some questions myself. Though the information was privileged, I guilted them into giving up some details, claiming I needed some peace of mind so I could sleep at night. The fact that I was just a frail old man helped too. It would seem my neighbor was a high-ranking disciple in an android cult hell-bent on infiltrating various government agencies. They were currently in the process of recruiting new members to aid in their cause. That's all I was told, which was more than I thought I'd get. This was enough to placate my curiosity and keep me from dwelling on the events as they unfolded. I thanked the man on the other end and hung up, content with my findings. After ending the call, I heard a knock at my front door. I didn't usually get visitors that late at night, but I suspected it would be one of my neighbors, asking about the sting operation that just took place next door. I opened the door, and to my surprise, there was no person there to greet me. No, not a person. Instead, there was a dog identical to my neighbor's. Before I could process its arrival, it trotted inside and sat on the floor. A voice then emanated from its collar. Shut the door. I did as the dog said, baffled and afraid. Hello, I am Serial 724234. I will be your core companion on your journey of fulfillment. True adventure awaits. Would you like to begin your first task? I didn't know how to respond or what in God's name was happening, but it was at this point that I felt an itch running up the length of my torso. It was subtle at first, but grew to the point that I had to reach down my shirt and scratch at it. That's when I felt a familiar metal caress my fingers. It took a moment for it to sink in, but I knew exactly what I was feeling. It was a zipper. We had always dreamed of leaving the city behind, finding a place that was ours. Away from the noise, the constant hustle, and the suffocating crowds. When Claire found the house, it seemed too perfect to be true. A crumbling old home on the edge of a quiet town, the kind of place that offered peace but hinted at something more. Claire, with her artist's eyes, saw beauty in every weathered corner, in the peeling paint and the overgrown vines that clung to the walls like some forgotten secret. I, on the other hand, was more practical, a history teacher who spent my days explaining the past to students who rarely paid attention. The history of this house, however, called to me. The first thing Claire did was walk straight to the garden, as if it were a piece of unfinished work waiting for her touch. She always had a way of seeing things differently, and there was something about the wildness of that place that fascinated her. I wasn't quite so enchanted. The garden seemed more chaotic than beautiful. Flowers that bloomed in odd patterns, vines that twisted unnaturally, ivy creeping up every surface. But I kept my thoughts to myself. She was happy, and in the end, that was all that mattered to me. The first few days passed without incident. We unpacked, settled in, and started to make the house our own. Claire spent most of her time in the garden, sketching, taking pictures, her enthusiasm growing with each passing hour. It was all she could talk about. She'd describe the strange flowers she'd found, or the way the light hit the garden at dusk, and I'd listen, nodding politely, unable to share her fascination. Still, I loved her enough to indulge her, and after all, I had my own work to focus on. Researching the house's history, something that seemed important to me, but I couldn't quite explain why. Then there was Mrs. Drake, the old woman who lived next door. We hadn't seen much of her at first, but it wasn't long before I felt her eyes on us. I'd catch her watching us from her porch, always at a distance, her gaze unsettling. It wasn't that she looked unfriendly. On the contrary, her expression was unreadable, as though she were trying to figure us out. Still, there was something about her presence that made me uneasy, like a memory of something forgotten. One afternoon, Claire was bent low, pulling weeds from the garden, when Mrs. Drake appeared at the fence, her voice sharp as it cut through the air. "That garden isn't yours to tend," she said, her words as abrupt as the crack of a branch underfoot. "Leave it be before it takes something from you." Claire didn't respond immediately, and I could see her raise an eyebrow, intrigued rather than alarmed. I had to admit, I was curious too. But Claire, always one to dismiss superstition, merely smiled. "We're just getting started," she called out. "Don't worry, Mrs. Drake, we'll take good care of it." Mrs. Drake didn't reply. She simply turned and walked away, her thin frame disappearing into the shadow of her house. That was the first time we'd heard the warning, but it wouldn't be the last. Over the next few weeks, I began to notice small changes in the garden. Nothing that Claire seemed to pick up on, of course. She was too engrossed, lost in her artwork and the mystery of the plants. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The vines grew faster than they should, twisting and knotting themselves in strange patterns overnight. Flowers that had bloomed in clusters one day were suddenly arranged in unnatural spirals, as if they were trying to communicate in some way I couldn't understand. The scent of the air, too, had changed, shifting from the pleasant floral notes I remembered to something heavier, earthier, almost pungent. Claire didn't seem concerned, though. In fact, the more time she spent in the garden, the more obsessed she became. I'd often find her out there at all hours of the day, sometimes long after the sun had set, her eyes wide, lost in whatever she was seeing. I tried to talk to her about it, but she would just smile and wave me off. "You're overthinking things," she'd say. "It's just a garden. It's beautiful, Ben. You should come out here more." I tried to make sense of it all. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I'd been buried in research, digging through the house's history, looking for clues. My curiosity about the land had turned into an obsession of my own. I discovered that the house had been built on land that had once been home to an old cemetery, one that had long since been forgotten, but the records were scarce, incomplete. There were rumors about missing persons from decades ago, whispers of people vanishing without a trace, and vague mentions of a secretive group. It was all speculation, really nothing concrete. But still, the more I read, the more I couldn't help but feel that the house, this land, was hiding something darker than just overgrown gardens and crumbling foundations. I didn't want to worry Claire. She was already so consumed by the garden, by whatever it was that had caught her attention. But one night, as I was coming back from town, I saw her standing at the edge of the garden, staring into the darkened maze of vines. It was well past midnight, and I couldn't understand why she hadn't come inside. "Claire," I called out, my voice breaking the silence. She didn't answer right away. When she finally turned to face me, her eyes looked distant, unfocused. Like she was seeing something beyond the garden, something I couldn't. "Ben," she whispered, her voice strained, as if she'd been holding something back. "I've been dreaming about it, about the garden. There's something alive in it, something that watches me." I felt a chill run down my spine. It was the first time she'd said anything like that. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm. She shook her head, her eyes flickering to the garden once more. "I can't explain it, but I need to go deeper. I need to understand it." I could feel the pull of her obsession, the same way I'd felt the pull of my own curiosity about the house's history. But this wasn't the same. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut, that unsettling tightness that only grew with each passing day. The next day, I decided to take action. I went to town to ask around to see if anyone knew anything about the history of the garden, the land, or the house. It was time to get answers before Claire fell any further into the garden's grip. When I returned, I found Claire in the garden again, kneeling beside an old stone marker hidden in the overgrowth. She was digging with her bare hands, the dirt flying up around her like a whirlwind. Something in her expression, her frantic energy, told me that I was too late. I rushed over to her, pulling her away from the marker, but as I did, I saw what she had uncovered. A human skull. It was wrapped in thick, gnarled roots, and small flowers had grown inside the hollow sockets, giving the skull an eerie, almost unnatural look. Claire gasped as she reached for it, her fingers trembling. I don't know what this is," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and fascination. But I knew. I knew that whatever this was, it wasn't something we could just ignore. The garden had taken something, and it wasn't finished yet. I didn't know how to react to the skull. It felt like everything had shifted in that moment, like the ground beneath us had cracked open to reveal something far darker than we'd ever expected. Claire looked at me, her eyes wide, but there was no fear in them. Only a strange, almost morbid fascination. It was like she was drawn to the skull, to the roots that had wrapped around it, as if they were pulling her into the past. I grabbed her hand and pulled her away from it, my heart racing. "Claire, we need to get inside. Now." She didn't resist, but her gaze stayed fixed on the skull, as if it were calling to her. "It's just a bone, Ben," she said quietly, as if trying to convince herself. "Maybe it's from one of the old graves. You know, this land used to be a cemetery. This might be nothing." But I could tell she didn't believe it herself. There was something else in her voice, something I couldn't quite place. The air around us felt heavier, thicker, as though the very ground we stood on was alive in a way I couldn't understand. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept turning over the details in my mind. The skull, the strange flowers, the way the vines had seemed to pulse with life, and I couldn't shake the memory of Mrs. Drake's warning. "Leave it be before it takes something from you." Was it just a coincidence, or was she trying to tell us something? I knew I had to dig deeper. Claire was lost in the garden, and the more I saw of her obsession, the more I feared for her. So I went back to the old town records, hoping to find something I had missed. It wasn't long before I found an article buried in a dusty folder, a small mention of a series of disappearances in the town decades ago. The names were familiar, but it was the final sentence that caught my attention. They were last seen near the old cemetery, where rumors of a secretive cult had begun to resurface. A cult. The word sent a chill down my spine. I knew there had been stories, vague whispers about a group of people who had once lived in this area, but no one ever spoke of them in detail. The article mentioned nothing more, and when I tried to trace the names of the missing, I found nothing but more dead ends. But one thing was clear. The garden, the house, and the land had all been connected to something darker than just a few old graves. I tried to talk to Claire about it the next day, but she wouldn't listen. She was too far gone. "You're overthinking this, Ben," she said, her voice distant, like she was speaking from somewhere far away. "The garden is beautiful. It's a part of this house, a part of me. I couldn't get through to her. It was as if the garden had wrapped its roots around her, just as it had done with a skull. She couldn't see what I saw, and worse, she didn't want to. Mrs. Drake's warnings still echoed in my mind, but I had no way of knowing what to do. The more I looked into the house's history, the more I realized I had no idea what we were truly dealing with. Whatever had happened here in the past was far more sinister than a mere cult, and whatever had been buried beneath the soil was still alive. It had awakened, and it was hungry. I went back to the garden later that afternoon, hoping to find some kind of answer, something that would make sense of all this madness. But when I arrived, I found Claire kneeling by the stone marker again, her fingers tracing the dirt. She didn't notice me at first. When she finally looked up, her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with fear. "Ben," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I saw something. Something in the garden. It was watching me." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Whatever it wasn't just a dream. The garden was alive, and it was aware of us. But how far would it go to keep us here? And what would it take before it took everything we had? The answer, I was beginning to understand, was everything. The days blurred together, and every passing hour felt like I was walking further into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Claire's obsession with the garden grew more intense with each day, and despite my best efforts, I couldn't reach her. She would wander into the maze of vines at all hours, her hands brushing against the leaves as if they were old friends, as if the garden were the only thing that understood her. I tried everything. I brought her tea, hoping it would break the spell. I suggested we take a walk, just the two of us, anywhere but the garden. But nothing worked. She had become consumed. The strange energy in the air seemed to pull her in, and I couldn't pull her out. One afternoon, after another fruitless attempt to talk some sense into her, I went back to Mrs. Drake. If anyone knew the truth, it was her. She had lived here longer than anyone else, had been here when the town's secrets still lingered like smoke in the air. I found her sitting on her creaky porch, watching the house with that same unsettling gaze. She looked up when I approached, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You came back," she said, her voice low, like she was waiting for something. "I need to know what's going on," I said, my frustration leaking through. "What is happening to my wife? What is happening to this garden?" Mrs. Drake was silent for a long moment, her wrinkled hands folded in her lap. I could see the hesitation in her eyes. It was like she was deciding whether or not to speak the truth, or perhaps whether or not she wanted to be free of whatever weight she had carried for so long. "It's not the garden that's dangerous," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "It's the land beneath it. This place was never just a cemetery. It was the site of an old cult. One that believed the garden had power to raise the dead. But they needed bodies. They needed life. The plants were their offering to the earth, to feed the soil. But it wasn't enough." She looked at me, her eyes hollow with old sorrow. "The garden isn't just alive. It feeds off the dead. It grows from the remains of those the cult sacrificed. The plants, they thrive on blood, on decay. And when they're hungry, they take what they need, what they want." I stood there, stunned, the gravity of her words hitting me like a freight train. The missing persons, the skull in the garden, the flowers that had been growing from it. It all made sense now, but it made me sick to my stomach. This wasn't just some overgrown patch of land. It was a feeding ground, a place of death and rebirth. And Claire had become part of it. "Your wife," Mrs. Drake continued, her voice tinged with sadness. "She's already too deep into it. She's the one the garden wants next. And if you don't stop her, if you don't stop the garden, it will take everything from you." I felt a cold chill run down my spine as the implications of her words settled in. This wasn't just about a haunted garden. This wasn't just about superstition or strange occurrences. This was real, and it had been waiting for us. "But what do I do?" I asked, the desperation creeping into my voice. "How do I stop it?" Mrs. Drake's eyes hardened. "There's only one way. You must destroy it. Burn it to the ground. But be warned, the garden won't go down without a fight. The plants won't let go easily, and if you're not careful, you might just become part of it." The fear that had been gnawing at me for weeks suddenly felt overwhelming. But I knew there was no choice. The garden had already claimed too much, and if I didn't act now, it would take Claire, and then it would come for me. I went back home, my mind racing, my heart pounding in my chest. The sun was already setting, casting long shadows across the yard. I found Claire again, standing in the garden, her hands gently caressing the vines as if they were alive, as if they were comforting her. Her face was blank empty, as though the garden had already claimed her soul. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were distant, focused on something only she could see. "Claire," I said, my voice breaking, "please, you have to come inside. We have to leave." But she didn't move. She just stood there, rooted to the spot. And that's when I saw it. The vines, the roots. They were moving, creeping toward her, almost like they were alive. I could see the way they were stretching, reaching for her legs, trying to pull her down into the earth. "Claire," I shouted, rushing toward her, but it was too late. The garden had already begun to claim her. Mrs. Drake's warning echoed in my mind as I realized the horrifying truth. The garden wasn't just alive, it was hungry, and it had been waiting for us to walk right into its grasp. I grabbed Claire, my hands shaking as I pulled her away from the vines that were curling around her legs, pulling her toward the earth beneath. Her eyes were wide, but she didn't seem to see me. Her gaze was fixed on something deeper, something far beyond me. She was lost in the garden, and no matter how hard I tried, it felt like the garden itself had her, like it had already claimed her spirit. "Claire, please," I begged, but she didn't respond. The vines tightened, and I could feel the weight of them, like they were made of something far stronger than just plant life. It was as if they were made of bone, muscle, and sinew, all working together to pull her under. I pulled harder, my heart racing. But the harder I tried to pull her away, the more it felt like the garden was fighting back. The ground beneath my feet trembled, the air grew thick and heavy with the scent of decaying flowers, and the vines seemed to grow faster, thicker, wrapping around everything in their path. Then I saw her. Mrs. Drake, standing by the edge of the garden, holding a sickle in her hand, her face twisted in something between sorrow and triumph. Her eyes met mine, and there was no mistaking the cruel satisfaction in them. "You should have listened," she said, her voice harsh and sharp. "The garden doesn't belong to you. It never did. You were always just passing through, but now you're part of it. All of you." The sickle in her hand glinted in the dimming light, and for a moment I was frozen. I knew what she meant. Claire was already lost, already part of the garden, and the only thing that could save her was the destruction of the very thing that had drawn her in. But could I do it? Could I destroy the thing that had become so much a part of her? Mrs. Drake's words echoed in my mind, but it didn't matter. I had no choice. I had to act before it was too late. I turned back to Claire, desperation clawing at my throat. Her face was pale, her lips trembling as the vines slowly pulled her down. "Claire, fight. You have to fight." But she was already slipping away, her fingers slipping through mine like sand. The garden was winning. It was pulling her under, and I was powerless to stop it. I could hear Mrs. Drake laughing. "You think you can save her? You think you can stop it? The garden needs her. It's too late for you both." I looked down at the sickle in her hand, at the way it gleamed in the dying light, and I knew what I had to do. It was the only way. I rushed forward, pushing through the vines that were now swarming around me, wrapping themselves around my arms and legs. But I couldn't stop. I had to save her. I had to. I grabbed the sickle from Mrs. Drake's hand, the cold steel biting into my skin as I wrenched it away from her. She didn't fight me. She just stood there, her eyes filled with something close to pity. But I didn't have time for pity. I turned and swung the sickle, cutting through the thick vines that were trying to drag Claire into the earth. The plants hissed, recoiling from the blade as if it burned them. I kept swinging, desperation fueling my movements as I hacked at the vines that were choking the life out of her. Claire's eyes snapped back to me, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she seemed to see me. "Ben," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Help me." I pulled her free, my arms trembling as I dragged her away from the garden. The vines hissed in anger, snapping and twisting as they tried to reclaim her, but I didn't stop. I kept pulling her, her body heavy in my arms, until we reached the edge of the yard, away from the garden's grasp. Mrs. Drake's laughter stopped. She stood there, watching us, her face empty of emotion. "You've done it now," she said softly, almost regretfully. "The garden won't let you go. You're marked." I didn't care. I didn't care what she said. All that mattered was getting Claire out of that hellhole. I pulled her inside the house, slamming the door behind me, locking it as the sound of the garden's fury grew louder outside. But we were safe. At least for now. We sat together on the floor, Claire leaning against me, her body trembling as the adrenaline finally wore off. I could hear her ragged breathing, but she was still here. She was still with me. But I knew it wasn't over. Mrs. Drake was right. The garden had marked us. It had claimed us in ways we couldn't yet understand. And no matter how far we ran, it would always be there, waiting for us to return. Because in the end, the garden always gets what it wants. And it wasn't finished with us yet. The night was eerily quiet, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. I kept glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see the garden's vines creeping up the walls, ready to pull us back into its grasp. But nothing moved. The silence was suffocating, as though the world outside had stopped. Claire's breathing had steadied, but I could feel the tension in her body, the way her shoulders were tight, as if she were bracing for something she couldn't name. She hadn't spoken much since we came inside. Her gaze was distant, like she was somewhere far away, still lost in the garden. I sat beside her, trying to keep my own fears in check, but it was hard to ignore the fact that we were trapped. The house felt too small, the walls too close, like they were closing in on us. We couldn't stay here forever, not with the garden still out there, still calling to Claire. "We can't stay," I said, my voice low, barely above a whisper. "We have to leave. We need to get out of here." Claire didn't respond. Her fingers trembled slightly as she twisted a strand of her hair between them, her eyes still far off, lost in a world I couldn't reach. "It's not over," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "It's never going to be over." I looked at her, my heart sinking. I knew she was right. The garden had already claimed so much of her, and no matter how far we ran, no matter where we went, it would follow. I had seen the way the vines reacted to the sickle, the way they hissed and recoiled. It wasn't just a garden, it was something else. Something ancient. And it wasn't going to let us go. "We have to burn it down," I said, more to myself than to her. "We have to destroy it, or it'll keep coming back. It won't stop." Claire's eyes flickered toward me, finally locking onto mine. For the first time in what felt like days, she seemed to focus on me, really see me. "You're right," she said, her voice trembling. "But how do we do that? How do we destroy something like that?" I didn't have an answer. I didn't know how we could destroy a force like the garden. All I knew was that it was dangerous, that it had already claimed lives. More than just the people who had disappeared over the years. It had claimed Claire's soul, and it wasn't finished yet. I had to act, and I had to act fast. "We'll find a way," I said, trying to reassure her. "We'll figure it out." But deep down, I knew there wasn't much time. The garden was hungry, and it wouldn't stop until it had what it wanted. I could feel it in my bones, the way the earth seemed to pulse with a strange, ominous energy. It was waiting, and if I didn't do something soon, it would claim us both. I stood up, my hands shaking as I grabbed the old oil lamp from the table. I didn't know what I was going to do with it, but it was the only thing I had. Maybe fire was the answer. Maybe it would be enough to burn the garden to the ground, to take away its power once and for all. But as I stepped toward the door, I hesitated. There was a noise outside, a rustling like something was moving through the garden. It was faint at first, just a whisper on the wind, but then it grew louder, more distinct. The sound of leaves and vines shifting, creaking under pressure. The garden was moving. It was awake. I rushed to the door, opening it just a crack, and peered out into the yard. The garden was alive, twisting and shifting as if it were breathing, its vines writhing like snakes. I could see the faint outline of something, someone, standing in the midst of it. Mrs. Drake. She was there, watching, waiting. And then I saw it. A figure behind her, rising from the earth, emerging from the roots. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its skin was a patchwork of dirt and decay, like it had been pulled from the soil itself. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Mrs. Drake turned, her eyes locking onto mine through the door, her lips curling into a twisted smile. "You can't stop it," she said, her voice low and raspy. "The garden belongs to the earth, and once it has claimed you, it never lets go." I felt a surge of panic. The garden was growing, spreading faster than I could imagine. It was alive, and it was hungry, and it had me, and Claire, right where it wanted us. I turned, my heart pounding, and grabbed the oil lamp from the table. "We have to burn it," I said, my voice shaking. We have to burn it now before it's too late. I rushed outside, the lamp in my hand, and moved toward the garden. Claire was behind me, her footsteps hesitant, but I knew she was with me. She had to be. We stood at the edge of the garden, the firelight casting long shadows on the ground, and I raised the lamp high, ready to throw it onto the roots. The garden seemed to sense what I was about to do. The vines shuddered, their movements frantic, as if they knew their end was near. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest, and let the lamp fall. It shattered against the ground, and the fire erupted, spreading quickly across the garden. The vines screamed in fury, their shrill cries cutting through the air like a dying animal. The flames leapt higher, consuming the plants, burning everything in its path. Mrs. Drake screamed too, her voice echoing through the night, but she didn't run. She didn't try to escape. Instead, she stepped forward into the flames, her arms raised to the sky as she screamed praises to the garden. I watched as the fire consumed everything. The garden, Mrs. Drake, the earth itself. The vines writhed and thrashed, but the fire wouldn't be stopped. It spread like a wildfire, and the garden burned, shrieking in agony as it was finally destroyed. When the flames finally died down, the only thing left was the scorched earth beneath our feet, and the skeletal remains that had once been tangled in the roots. The garden was gone. We were free. But as we stood there, staring at the ruins of the place that had once claimed everything we loved, I knew one thing for sure. It would never truly be gone. The garden had marked us, and as long as we lived, it would always be watching. We left that night, our belongings packed into the car, and we didn't look back. The town, the house, the garden, it was all behind us now. Let me start out by saying that I am not a people person. When the pandemic hit North America, it was probably the best thing to happen to me. Most of my time is spent online anyway, seeing as I work in data collection for an auditing company. Let me tell you, that wasn't much fun either, given how crazy 2020 has been. Anyway, none of that has to do with the problem I've been having. But I figured that most people start these types of rants off with a few anecdotal notes, so there you go. In a nutshell, I like to be left alone. This is why when I walked out in early September and saw that my neighbors were already beginning to decorate their house with spooky stuff, like inflatable Frankensteins and ghosts, I was a bit put off. Now I will admit they do this almost every year. They have 4 boys, all in elementary, and of course they want the holidays to be a big time, so why should 2020 be any different? It's just that their house sits adjacent to mine, so when I walk out it's the first thing I see every single day. And now, thanks to these over-the-top decorations, I was going to be seeing even more of it. Gradually, each day they added to the house. A few hanging plastic bats here, some spider webs there. I was doing my best to ignore it, really. And I know exactly how I'm going to sound here, being the Grinch of Halloween to some, so naturally I kept it to myself. But that ended a few nights back when I started to hear the wails. They installed large stereo speakers near the attic. I think because the screams coming from the attic were intense. It sounded like they had literally managed to get a soundbite from a crime scene. Let me tell ya, hearing that kind of noise at 3:30 in the morning is a bit alarming. I instinctively dialed 911 and complained. I wasn't going to up all night simply because they wanted to turn their place into a haunted house. Unfortunately for me, the police said that if it wasn't a serious problem where other neighbors complained, that it wasn't a violation of any noise ordinances in the area. You can't be serious. Just listen to this. How am I supposed to get any sleep? I shouted, holding the phone so they could hear. Maybe that was a bit much, but I was pissed and had every right to be, I think. The operator reminded me that the line was meant for emergencies only and bid me a good night, leaving me frustrated and sleep-deprived. I went down to my kitchen, got a bottle of Jack, and drank enough to knock myself out on the couch, trying to time the obnoxious screams. The next day I had cooled down a little and went over to talk to my neighbor after breakfast. Crossing their front lawn was like going through a minefield, though thanks to the pop-up ghosts and graves they had placed in their yard. The first few nearly gave me a heart attack as I moved to the door, rapping my knuckles on it to get their attention. No one came. I tried again, but got no response, so I walked around to the garage and tried there. It was open, and I couldn't help but to notice that their car was gone, and there was a large pool of fake blood on the concrete floor. I stepped forward and noted that they had a few other decorations lying around like severed heads and zombie body parts, which I assumed would be placed in the yard. The whole thing smelled of high heaven. I held my nose and went to the door near their laundry room, trying again to get someone's attention, but again no one came. I sighed deeply and walked across the fake blood and paused to see where the bizarre smell was coming from. There were trash bags laying near the garage door, soaking wet from the recent storm, and I rolled my eyes, realizing it had to be that. Despite the fact that I wasn't feeling very neighborly, I went ahead and took the trash to the street and then went back to my house, wondering if any of my other neighbors would care enough to lodge a complaint. Other than this Halloween nut, the other folks around here are pretty ordinary, but none of them live close enough to really hear the noise. I decided instead that night to try and record it, so that way I could let the authorities listen and prove I was dealing with a nuisance on my block. Back home, I took a shower and got some equipment from downstairs ready to listen, but surprisingly, there was no screams that night, just silence. I stayed up to the wee hours. I sound so old saying that, but it's true. I was thinking maybe they realized I had called and complained about them, so that was why they were quiet. So I called it a night and decided to try again the next day. It was more of the same. Not a peep. In fact, I was starting to notice that not one of my neighbors was coming out of their house. This guy has 4 kids. It's hard to not notice them in the early morning as they scramble to catch the school bus. Especially because the driver of the bus is so courteous, he blasts his horn to get mom's attention for the littlest one to grab a face mask. But now there was nothing happening. It was that way for nearly a week, and I started to grow worried. At first I told myself it was because I hadn't gotten much sleep, but then I started doubting myself. What if the scream I heard hadn't been some kind of faux imitation? It rolled around in my mind like a pair of old dice, trying to figure out what I had heard. What if the wife had been attacked? What if it was a break-in? Then I thought back to the fake blood, and my body got stiff thinking of how I had stepped through it. Had I mistakenly walked into a real crime scene? The arms, the severed heads. My paranoia was screaming to me, my God, how could I have been so blind? I grabbed my robe and rushed out in the dead of night to go see, using my smartphone to guide the way across the murky suburb streets. Their house was so quiet now, not even a light on. I started to doubt myself again. Had it always been this quiet? I saw the plastic bats and the pop-up graves, and they seemed like they had been there a lot longer than I remembered. Checking the garage got me nowhere. Now, instead of seeing blood, it was spotless, as though someone had come in and cleaned the entire crime scene. It made me internally shiver as a dramatic scene played out in my mind. Chris, that was the husband's name. Chris was working in the kitchen, trying to get dinner ready because his wife Janice wasn't feeling good. It was a plot he had been brewing up for months, I told myself. He was gradually lacing her food to weaken her, and tonight he planned to finish the job. The scream I heard must have been when she realized something was off. Maybe Chris had decided he couldn't wait for her to just die. He wanted it swift. Had I seen him with a pretty young woman around town? Maybe. Yes, I think I had. In that coffee shop near the town square, was he having an affair? If I was his age and knew his wife couldn't perform in the bedroom, I wouldn't have blamed him. But murder wasn't the answer. All these thoughts scrambled through my brain as I stood there in the garage, taking in what had happened. I needed to get inside and check on the wife. What if he had left evidence? I ran back to my house, my heart racing now as I grabbed a few tools from my own shed. Some of them were missing, but I found what I needed. A crowbar could open my way into their house. I smashed it open in 2 tries and stepped into a dusty, dreary laundry room. Trying to turn on the lights had gotten nowhere. Instead, it was obvious that the family wasn't paying their bills. The house was cold like a tomb. My footsteps echoed down the empty corridor as I called out to anyone inside. But it looked like the place was abandoned. I took a step forward when abruptly a fake axe smashed its way out of the wall, and I jumped back. It was just another Halloween prop, but it looked so real, so lifelike. Chris must have just finished placing up more Halloween decorations when he decided to go upstairs and take care of his wife. The boys were in the den playing video games when they heard the screams. I imagined them running up to check on their mom, and then Dad panicked. He must have thought that the games would be loud enough that they wouldn't hear. Or he had hoped that Janice wouldn't put up a fight at all. He had miscalculated, and before he knew it, now he had a massacre on his hands. I walked up the steps, thinking of how he likely had hunted his own children in this house. They must have been so frightened. I could see different places in the wall where they had stopped to catch their breath or skirts in the rug where they had tried to hide. But their father was consumed with killing now. He was on a mission. Their begging and pleading wouldn't stop him. The little one probably went first, I thought as I got to the top of the stairs. The severed heads I had seen in the garage haunted me again as I thought of how he had murdered them. It was beyond repulsive. Upstairs I saw what looked like a hanging corpse. It was upside down from the rafters with its head loose as well, and it looked like it was meant to deter visitors from entering the master suite. I ignored the prop and pushed through, desperate to see if I was right about what had transpired. But the room looked empty as well. Other than more Halloween decorations, it was another immaculate example of how Chris had gone so far to cover his tracks. What had he done with the rest of their body parts, though? I thought about the trash I had taken out and felt sick. He must have cut up all their bodies and planned to toss them out. I stood there in a daze, realizing how far he had been willing to go. The poor children turned into shredded cheese just because of his lust for another woman. I couldn't help but to vomit and shudder as I ran to the bathroom. As I heaved and caught my breath over the toilet, I checked in there for more clues. He had to have used chemicals on Janice's body in the tub, I thought as I smelled the weird bleach. Dissolving her with acids would have been easy, but how had he gotten access to anything like that? Then I thought about my own shed. Had he broken in and taken my own tools? Was he trying to frame me for this? I'm not sure why my brain jumped to that, but it instantly made me paranoid and I swallowed hard. What did I do? I had already contacted the police. Should I file another report? But they hadn't listened the first time, so now it made me feel like I was going to be a troublemaker. What if I was wrong about all of this? I needed more proof, I decided. I moved back to the hallway where the corpse was dangling and got a better look at it. My stomach dropped as it occurred to me this was no prop. It was Chris. I scrambled to find a way to cut him down, hoping to God he was still alive. It seemed unlikely. There was no way that anyone could be after a few minutes, let alone days. But still I did my best to cut him down and tried to resuscitate him. His skin was blue and his body was rigid. I felt sick realizing that he had killed himself after finishing his family. It was the only answer that made sense. Some part of me felt it was deserved, though, if my guess of how events played out was true. There was no way anyone with a conscience could live with themselves after killing their children, I thought. I took my smartphone out and got a few pictures, the proof I would need to show the cops. Then I made my way out of there. It felt like the house was haunted now that I knew the reality of what had happened, and I didn't want to spend another hour in there. Not even 1 minute. Back home, I tiredly put the final pieces of the puzzle together in my brain. The only part that didn't make sense was Chris' lover. Surely she would have come looking for them. Where was she? I got some shut-eye and tried to not be mortified by the thought that maybe Chris had gone after her too. The next day I was rudely woken up by the sound of police at my door. I didn't remember calling them, but I let them in anyway. What they told me had me feeling sick. They were there with a warrant to search my premises. One of my neighbors had reported suspicious activity in the area and sounds of screaming. I nearly lost it, angered that they were taking these reports seriously instead of my own. But inwardly my stomach was twisting and turning. What if Chris had somehow planted evidence against me before he committed unaliving act? The officers combed the house and brought K9 units to sniff every nook and cranny. It didn't take long for them to find the trash bags, the ones I was sure that I had taken to the road, filled with body parts. The shed was next. They found trace evidence that my fingerprints were all over tools that were used to kill the family. I started to vomit, trying to find words that made sense. Of course my fingerprints would be there. They were my tools, for God's sake. I hardly knew what else to show them, so I insisted to the two officers they needed to check out Chris' house. That was where the true crime had been committed after all. They questioned me for what felt like hours. I literally was sure I was going to the slammer for this perceived crime. It felt like my life was over. I was frightened, shaking like a leaf as I told them what I believed happened. This is just a misunderstanding. I pay my taxes. I donate to the city. These people are the ones that are sick, I stammered. I told them how this had started with the family obsession for Halloween. My mind started to play tricks on me again as I replayed events. What if it had all been one massive stunt? What if none of it were real? I was losing my mind, my world was spinning. Were these even real cops? If so, they were going to toss me in a cell and throw away the key. But if not, I panicked as they kept writing their report and told them I needed to use the restroom. I went to vomit and to think. There wasn't going to be a way out of this if this was for real. All the evidence pointed toward me. My palms were sweaty and I started to convulse. There had to be a way out. I slammed my fist against the glass, causing shards to break in my hand. My fist was bloody now, but my hand was no longer shaking. In that moment, a new version of events played out in my head, one where I was the culprit. I'm not a people person. I hate my neighbors. Their decorations keep me up at all hours of the night, Halloween and Christmas. This year I had hoped that the pandemic would stop them, but it seemed to spur them on even further. Had I gone over there to confront them, got into a heated argument, and killed them all? No, it couldn't be. I didn't remember doing that. My reflection showed a twisted and dark smile, and it sent shivers down my spine. What was happening to me? I slammed at the glass again, trying to make it break entirely. The police managed to break the bathroom door down and pulled me away. The rest of the evening was a bit of a blur. They gave me something to calm my nerves and started talking about the event, the reality of what had really happened over the past few days. My neighbors have been dead for a year now, they said, and another neighbor down the street had grown concerned for my well-being when it seemed that I had checked on them more frequently, as though I thought they were still alive. They had no evidence to hold me because the trash bags that had body parts didn't seem to hold any fingerprints, so it could have easily been someone else that had dropped them there. They had been sitting in my shed, sliced up and cut for a year now. They said the crime was still ongoing investigation, and since they didn't have a warrant, they just had to bid me a good night, having finished with their wellness check. And I stared out toward the neighbor's house. It was abandoned, a crime scene from a year ago on Halloween when I had grown tired of their screams and antics. And as I stared at their decorations, I saw their ghosts standing in the front lawn, glaring at me, pointing at me for their deaths. I know now how this Halloween will play out, because even though I didn't anticipate this nightmare, now I've become a part of their celebration. I wish I never rented that cabin in the woods. Lately, I've been feeling drained. I haven't taken time off work in 2 years. By some miracle, we just hired someone competent enough to take some of the workload off our small department. My boss suggested I use up some vacation time. I hated flying, so that limited my options. I didn't ski, so that narrowed down my choices to almost nothing. Was there really nothing local? Would I be doomed to spend 2 weeks doing nothing at my place? I started to mindlessly scroll through vacation suggestions at work. An ad for a cabin caught my eye. It was near the local ski resort, but wasn't attached to them. The photos made it look almost too good to be true. A massive cozy log cabin empty and ready, waiting in the middle of a beautiful winter forest. And the price was good. I let myself think of sitting by a warm fire reading the backlog of books I've had piling up for years. Since I had no better ideas, I booked the cabin. By the end of the week, I had my bags packed. Driving down the one-lane forest road wasn't as troublesome as I thought it was going to be. The cabin's address wasn't on my GPS. Thankfully, the road was a straight path to my destination. I expected to see some wildlife on the way. Not even a small bird flew between the trees during the entire ride. At least it was quiet. The photos didn't do the cabin justice. It was far more breathtaking in person. I wondered how I got a location like this for so cheap. Someone had been there recently to shovel a pathway and remove the snow off the front stairs. But I didn't see any footprints. It took a few trips to haul all my bags into the place. I was glad someone maintained the walkway, or else I could have broken my neck. It was cold inside. I wasted no time turning on the heat and starting a fire. I then checked out the kitchen to make sure I had enough food for the week. I mostly packed snacks, so I might need to take a trip into town. To my shock, the pantry was stocked with a note saying I could help myself. Really, how did I get so lucky with this place? The drive hadn't been very long, and yet I collapsed on the couch in front of the fire. The years of hard work caught up to me. I made sure the fire had enough wood to keep it going for a few hours, then curled up under some heavy blankets for a short nap. My short nap turned into sleeping till the middle of the night. A noise dragged me out of my dreams. The fire had died down and my stomach hurt from hunger. I got up to get the fire started again when the noise came back. Someone was knocking at the cabin door. I froze scared for some reason. I felt more tired than I did before my nap. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to keep away the chill. Should I answer the door? There shouldn't be any reason why someone would be in the middle of the woods at this time of the night. At first, I assumed the person who knocked was dangerous. Then I realized they could have just broken in and not knocked first. Still, I grabbed the iron fire poker before I went to the door. "Hello," I called out. "Oh, hello, I got a bit lost. Can you tell me if there is a town nearby?" A female voice came from behind the door. My hand started to reach for the handle. Then I considered she might have a tougher male friend waiting to charge the door when my defenses were down. "Yes, there is one down the main road," I said, wondering how she got here if she hadn't used the only road up. "Road? Oh, I see your tire tracks. Maybe I could follow them." "Hey, are you all right in there, or do you need help getting out?" she asked, as if that question was normal. What the hell was she talking about? A fierce chill shot down my back. I opened my mouth to respond, but movement out of the corner of my eye caught my attention. I could see some windows in the living room from where I stood. It was pitch dark outside. A white shape started to appear in that darkness. My heart froze as a pale face got closer to the window. The ghoulish appearance was something made of nightmares. A wide black smile pressed against the glass. The dark eyes made contact with my own. Then a loud banging came from the front door. I nearly jumped out of my skin. When I looked back, the face in the window was gone. I ran to where I left my cell phone. The thing refused to turn on. The banging still echoed through the entire cabin as my shaking hands plugged the charging cord into my phone. Still nothing. I then ran around making sure every door was locked. As I went by the windows, I briefly saw more of those pale faces outside. What the hell was going on? I noticed something at the top of one of the kitchen windows. I reach over to grab a cord. A wooden set of shutters slid out from under the wall and locked at the bottom. I'm sure if someone tried hard enough, they could get through the shutter, but at least it was an extra layer of protection. I found out all the windows had these shutters. The banging sound grew quieter each time I covered a window. I even ran upstairs to lock up the ones in the bedrooms just in case. While I raced around, I kept hearing that female voice offering help and telling me to just go outside. Like hell I would ever do that. When the last window had been covered, the noises from outside stopped. I soon found out none of the landline phones worked. My cell phone refused to turn on no matter what I tried. I was safe inside the cabin but trapped. Could I wait out whoever or whatever was outside? I had enough food for the week. My boss knew where I was going, so when I didn't come back, he would call the police, right? I didn't want to wait this out for a week. I wanted to get the hell out of here now. I got the fire going again. A chill got into my body and down to my bones. I knew I needed to keep my strength up, so I ate some of the snacks while I sat shaking on the couch, iron fire poker within arm's reach. For some reason, I started to feel exhausted. Soon I couldn't keep my eyes open and fell asleep even though I was still scared out of my mind. I woke up in a cold cabin. I couldn't tell what time it was. There were no clocks and my phone was still dead. I didn't dare risk opening the shutters to see what time of day it was outside. I've never felt this cold in my life. I piled on layers of clothing. Not even the fireplace or turning the heat up to the max helped get rid of the chill. A scratchy feeling came to the back of my throat. I was getting sick on top of everything else. I needed to warm up. To my disappointment, the shower only had slightly warm water. I almost felt colder after a quick shower. My stomach churned. The snacks from the night before weren't sitting well. I tried to make a can of soup, but my body rejected it. I found my way back to the couch and under a pile of blankets. I felt awful. In the short time since I'd woken up, my health did a major downward spiral. Soon I felt too sick to do anything but sleep for another few hours. What time was it when I woke back up? I had no idea. A soft knocking sound made me stir. I heard a low voice, but couldn't make out what they were saying. Slowly, I started towards the door. My body hurt too much from fever and chills to pick up my weapon. You need to get out of there. The female voice from before whispered, "Come out here, I'll help you." I shook my head even though she couldn't see it. "Don't lie, I know you have others with you." I hissed, my voice raspy from my illness. "Others? Is that what you saw? You sound awful. I don't know if you'll last more than a day or so inside there." What was she talking about? Was she suggesting that somehow I was sick because I was inside the cabin? No, she was just trying to say anything to get me outside. But still, I wanted to trust her because I was scared. I crept to the nearest window to unlock the shutter. I opened it just enough to see out of. My eyes hurt from the blinding snow outside. When they adjusted to the light, I started to scan the trees looking for any signs of the creatures from last night. There weren't any tracks in the snow. Had I just been seeing things? A dark shape moved from between the trees. Then another. More appeared, somehow aware I was looking outside. Within seconds, countless twisted and misshapen human forms started to come from the forest. Some were dragged behind the bodies of animals they killed, the monsters' mouths covered with blood. If I went outside, I would be eaten next. Suddenly, a human face appeared just outside the window. A young woman with green eyes and red hair smiled at me. For a moment, the fear left. She looked so friendly, I almost considered going outside with her. Then, her wide smile started to get wider. I slammed the shutter down, locking it. I didn't know what those monsters were or why they hadn't gotten inside yet. For now, I was safe inside the cabin. The horrors were outside, and they needed to stay like that. The girl pleaded with me to come outside. I tried to ignore her. The illness started to get worse. Soon I found myself unable to stand for long. I once again made my way to my safe space on the couch. My mind was muddled with a sudden fever, making it impossible to think. Before I passed out, I heard the girl outside speak once more. "I'll somehow get you out here." How long did I sleep? I didn't know. I couldn't move. My throat hurt. My body hurt. I could barely keep my eyes open. Was this how I died? Alone in the middle of nowhere? I didn't even like cabins, so why did I come here? I could have read all those books at home. Another banging noise woke me. This time it was different. I also smelled smoke. But I didn't remember the last time I got up to add to the fire. A burst of energy came to my body as I stood up, trying to understand what was happening. To my horror, I saw smoke pouring out from through the shutters. I quickly realized the cabin was on fire. The flames hadn't reached inside yet, but if I didn't get out soon, I would die from the smoke. I coughed, the air quickly becoming dense. I started to make my way to the front door, but then my body stopped. For some reason, I couldn't control my actions. A groaning sound came from the walls. It almost sounded like a scream. Tears stung my eyes as I was forced to watch my body move away from freedom. I ended up in the kitchen. Someone else was there. It was hard to see her full features because of the thick air. She was coughing as well. "Come on, you'll die in here," she shouted. The back door had been busted open. She held a large hammer in her hand, showing how she'd gotten in. I took a few steps closer, but my hand moved on its own. In one swift movement, I grabbed a knife off the counter and attacked her with it. She backed up, but I still sliced a deep cut across her left eye. I wanted to stop. I didn't want to hurt her. Blood flowed from her wound and to the floor. For some reason, the wood absorbed the liquid, leaving no traces. "Sorry about this," she said and raised the hammer. The last thing I remember inside that cabin was a shock of pain against my temple. I woke up again, cold and throat raw. My body refused to stop shaking. But the fever was gone. I was very weak. For some odd reason, I sat in my car, the cabin in front fully engulfed in flames. A screaming sound came from the building. and I could have sworn I saw a burst of dark smoke come from the flames flying off deep into the woods. I called the police. Just hold on till then. I looked over to see the redhead taking off her jacket to wrap it around my shaking body. I tried to speak, but my throat was too dry. She helped me get a sip of water from a bottle she brought along. Her left eye closed from the wound I had given her. "I'm sorry," I croaked. "Don't worry about it. My eye is fine, and I'll have a neat scar." She replied with a smile. "The cabin." I started, then coughed. "Yeah, it was draining your life force and stuff like that. I'm glad I got to you in time. You'll recover in a few weeks. Anyway, I gotta go. Later, Gator." I couldn't stop her. I wanted to thank her or to find out her name, but she left not wanting to stick around for when the police showed up. I was admitted to the hospital. When I was able, there was a round of questioning. I didn't have a lot of answers. There was a shell of a burned-down cabin, but there hadn't been any registered in the area. The road that led to the cabin disappeared before the police showed up. It was a miracle they got through the woods to find me. I said I had rented the cabin through an online ad, but there hadn't been any charge on my credit card, and I couldn't find the ad again. They were puzzled but lacked any clues to go forward. I've heard whispers that people had started to disappear inside those woods. A year ago, 2 bodies had been found inside the shell of a house that should not have been in the forest. They had been within walking distance of a town. No one understood why they let themselves starve to death inside an abandoned home. I needed a few weeks off work to recover. At least my boss was good about it. I was thankful I had lived through the worst vacation anyone could ever take. But not having answers bothered me. I really wanted to thank that strange girl who saved me. I wanted to tell my story mostly to warn others there was something unnatural lurking off in the forest. There are some dark things in this world. And there are some decent people too. Let's hope you never come across darkness without some light appearing to guide your way out. My family, me, mom, stepdad went on a trip to the Smoky Mountains outside Pigeon Forge when I was roughly 14-15. They rented a fairly secluded cabin in the mountains. No others could be seen from ours. The house setup was where the first floor front side was ground level, and the other side was a wraparound balcony, and then a downstairs bedroom. I stayed in the room on the main floor, and it was on the gravel road side. My mom and stepdad were downstairs. The first night I don't sleep well since it's a strange place, and I'm just laying in bed. No clue what time it is, but I hear the gravel crunching outside. I listen with my heart racing, and I distinctly remember it sounding like footsteps slowly walking to right outside my window. I listened for a while and was sure it was not an animal because it was slow-paced steps. I run downstairs and tell my mom. She blows it off and says it's an animal since we are in the woods. Sure. The next evening, while everyone is still awake and lights are on, the house alarm goes off. My mom and stepdad are looking around, and we find a window cracked in the first floor living room where I've been sitting. The window is on the balcony side, and none of us had touched it. We shut and locked it. They go back downstairs, and I continue reading on the couch. Not half an hour later, the alarm goes off again. At this point, our nerves are shot. They come back upstairs, and my stepdad goes outside to the gravel. My mom and I are by the door which connects with the wraparound balcony. Not sure why I had a big rock or what made me throw it, but I hurled it over the balcony, making a loud noise. This must have startled the person because they ran down the balcony and out the exit on the other side. They believed me then. It was definitely a someone and not an animal. We packed our stuff and got the hell out of there right then. It sticks in my mind and is still so vivid. So glad we left. I got stuck in a cabin on a snowy winter night. What I witnessed can't be of this world. I grew up treasuring nature so much. If I went to the woods, fishing, or in the mountains, the tranquility these experiences brought with them had no match. Some were even ethereal. I could feel Mother Nature living and breathing. always ensuring I had everything I needed while stepping on its rich grounds. Last year, I bought a cabin up in the mountains. I have always liked to disconnect from the city in the cold winter and just go to a place that feels like magic. This cabin had the feeling of being somewhere in that realm. Excitement took over me when I thought I finally had my own place in the snowy mountains. Away from the city, away from work, and from people who make so much noise that sometimes I just need a little breather. So the acquisition of the log cabin couldn't have come at a better time. With my head almost exploding and my mind fogged with the dullest things and the most mundane tasks possible at work, I couldn't wait for a few days to recharge my batteries. With no other than my trusted associate, my daring sidekick, and my best friend, the Irish setter Blaze, who had just turned 6 years old, I decided to pack all the things needed and go. I drove for almost 3 hours. The trees hung heavy with snow, and the flakes fell slowly on the ground. I felt like being in a fairy tale, a vastness of white that conquered all the old land for miles and miles in front of my eyes. I stopped the car somewhere along the way to get fresh water from a spring that ran through the frozen woods. The sight was a spectacle, and I couldn't help but drink. It was so cold I felt my chest turning to ice. Yet it was so refreshing. So I took a few gallons with me for the cabin so Blaze and I wouldn't get dehydrated. I reached the cabin in the afternoon. The temperature began dropping as nightfall approached. I had maybe 2 hours tops of daylight. I parked the car, took the supplies and food inside, turned on the generator, grabbed some firewood, and threw it into the fireplace. I poured some gasoline over, and the flame engulfed the logs. After that, I began shoveling the snow on the front porch and around the house. I also took my hunting rifle because I thought a rabbit stew wouldn't hurt anyone. I always liked it, and Blaze liked it too. Time passed quickly enough, and after finishing all the chores, the time came to go inside and make some food. I had some canned dog food for Blaze, and as I felt my stomach growling, the mouth-watering image of sausage and eggs on toast came to mind. I lit some candles to make the ambience more pleasant. I also turned on a lantern, and everything seemed to be perfect. Night fell over the isolated cabin, and the winter winds howled outside over the infinite blanket of snow. Shadows danced on the walls like little devils. The crackling wood sang its song, bringing peace to my tired mind. The cabin felt like a gift from God. I had no television to distract me and didn't check the internet. I only kept my cell phone with me as a precautionary measure because accidents could have happened. Even though the reception had been pretty bad, it still allowed to call 911. After finishing eating, I enjoyed a beer and a book. I fell asleep in an instant, poof, just like that. The fresh air has had this effect on me ever since I was a kid. The book fell from my lap and thudded on the floor. I instantly jolted awake and saw Blaze looking at the door. He stood still, mildly growling. "What's wrong, boy?" I asked. I could see he was trembling both with anger and fear. He began nervously barking. I had never seen him like that before. Outside, in the howling wintry winds, I heard some sort of static sound combined with a low gurgling sound. It was as if someone was zapping through a broken TV where one channel was just annoying static, and the next was unspeakable monsters raging. I peeked outside and saw nothing. Then I grabbed my rifle and wanted to open the door and check it out in person. Yet, Blaze wouldn't let me do that. Instead, he stood before the door, barking at me this time. Whatever roamed outside, Blaze felt it necessary to let me know if I went there. I would have found only death. "What the hell is that thing out there?" I whispered to myself. I glanced outside the window again, and I thought I saw a shadowy figure looking at the cabin. It looked back and then went out of sight. Blaze barked as loud as his lungs could take it. "Blaze, come here, boy. Get here now," I called him. The only weak point was the window. If whatever was outside wanted to jump through like a beast, I said let it have it. I would have put 2 bullets between its eyes in seconds. Blaze would have probably eaten the whole thing in one big fat meal. The static and gurgling sounds never ceased, even though the creature had vanished. I rechecked the window. Nothing, I only heard those sounds. After a while, a large band came from the door, and then it came again, repeatedly. It shook, and I got my gun ready to shoot. If that door had fallen, the death of whatever was on the side would have been swift. "Hey man, open up. These things outside will kill me. Please," the voice of a scared man said. He kept banging on the door as if his life depended on it. And it did. If I didn't act fast, the poor man would have been mauled to death by whatever beasts roamed the old mountain. "Hold up, I'm coming," I cried. I had to help that poor man. He was probably lost, scared, alone, and dehydrated. Blaze jumped in front of the door. He barked at me again, pushing me back. Something was wrong if he did that. "Come on, man, just open the door already, will ya?" He banged again. Blaze kept on barking violently. "Sorry, Hoss. No can do," I replied, understanding that this was something else, not a man. I trusted Blaze more than I trusted myself. He was one brave and intelligent dog, a true friend and companion. The beast howled, and I heard its voice changing as it drowned. It coughed, it spat, and I thought it was asphyxiating. "Sweetie, can you please open up for Mama? I have a gift for you. It took me so long to find you, and I want to give it to you," my mother's voice said. "What the?" I said, almost dropping the rifle from my hands. My mom died when I was just a kid, and except for her warm smile, the voice was the only other thing I remembered about her. Then banging noises came from around the house, as if the number of creatures outside had grown exponentially. I had gone there expecting to find paradise and solitude, but it turns out hell had frozen over in that exact place. Nothing natural and of this world could have made those noises and then mimicked my dead mother's voice. Again, I checked the situation outside. The shadowy creatures had grown in numbers. I counted 12 of them. 6 just stood motionless while the other 6 growled, snarled, and howled in the dead of night. I saw one of them coming closer to the window and went a few steps back. It glued its dead eyes to the window. It didn't have a nose, just 2 small holes. Its mouth was a straight horizontal line. It opened it and sucked on the window. In doing so, it revealed small rows of sharp teeth. "Why don't you open up for your dear old grandfather? It's cold outside, sonny boy," the creature snarled. "Grandpa died too when I was just a kid. After my mom's death, he had a heart attack because he couldn't cope with her being gone." I just looked at it as it mimicked my grandfather's voice. I don't know how the hell it knew my mom's or my grandfather's voice, but it happened. Maybe it read my mind and browsed my memories. Maybe by doing so, it extracted their voices from my head. Hell, this sounded crazy as hell to me, but what I had witnessed shouldn't have been possible. And just seeing that craziness, every scenario I thought of might have been likely. The glass began to crack under the pressure of the creature's face. But fortunately, I had parked the Jeep right in front of the house, so that I might have just made a run for it. The banging all across the house intensified, and I felt the pressure of death clawing my heart. The window would give in soon, so I said to hell with it. Instead, I pointed the rifle straight at the ugliness and pulled the trigger. It blasted its head into millions of pieces, and everything stopped. "Blaze, we're gonna make a run for it, buddy," I said, hoping for the both of us to escape that mess. I grabbed a burning piece of wood from the fireplace with one and busted through the door. The shadowy creatures had even grown in numbers, probably 20 or 30 of them. Blaze barked, foaming at the mouth. "William, William, William," a raspy voice said. It was alien to me, not similar to anyone I knew. I turned around and saw them all gathered in a herd, waiting to attack. "Stay back," I said, threatening them with the torching wood. They hissed and collectively stepped back. I threw the wood at them, and they scattered in an instant. I opened the car door for Blaze to go in, and he immediately jumped in the passenger's seat. A pair of claws grabbed my ankle from under the Jeep and pulled me. It caused me to fall, and I saw the abomination crawling up on my leg. I hit it in the head with the butt of the rifle. Then, when it hissed with its horrible mouth, I put the barrel in it and shot. It blew its brain out on the side of my car. I hit the ignition, and the car came to life. Blaze was agitated and scared. I patted him on the head and told him it would be all right. I pushed the pedal to the metal and ran over those creatures, feeling their skulls crack under the wheels. A few hours later, I was back in my apartment with Blaze. It was quiet. Maybe the city wasn't so bad after all. This happened last year. A few weeks after the incident, I received an anonymous message saying, "Hello, William. You need to come back to the cabin. There are urgent matters that I need to talk to you about. I am one of your neighbors. Sincerely, Thomas." I did remember seeing a few houses on my way up there, but didn't think to stop. Also, the former owner had vanished into thin air. I didn't go back yet, maybe somewhere in the future. I set out in my car towards a mountainous region to go to the old house that was my family's legacy. When I got home, I saw the log cabin. Spider webs were everywhere, and it was freezing inside. The cold air nipped at my skin, sending shivers down my spine. The wooden floors creaked under my weight, echoing through the silent house. Dust particles floated in the beams of sunlight that managed to pierce through the grimy windows. When I went out to get wood, I noticed something behind the trees. It was just a fleeting shadow, but it was enough to make my heart race. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly, but the figure suddenly disappeared. I stood there for a moment, the forest eerily silent around me. I told this to the neighbor across the street, an old man with a weathered face and kind eyes. He said it might be my imagination, that I looked tired. He invited me in for a cup of coffee, and we chatted for a while. The warmth of his home and the smell of freshly brewed coffee was comforting. In the morning, I noticed items scattered around the house. Books, old photographs, and some kitchen utensils were strewn across the floor. I was in a deep sleep and didn't pay attention to the sounds outside. It was evening before I finally cleaned the area around the house. I decided to go to the market in the evening and got in the car. However, I was surprised when my car battery died. Frustrated, I got out of the car, and when I opened the hood, I heard the sound of glass breaking. Panic surged through me as I ran home, only to find shards of glass scattered on the ground. The windows of my house were not broken, adding to the mystery. As I walked towards the car, I noticed that the tire was flat. Someone had slashed it, leaving me stranded. I went to the neighbor across the street again. He didn't say anything about the glass, but suggested there might be a stone in the wheel of the car. He offered me to spend the night with them, and I accepted. Their hospitality was a welcome relief from the eerie happenings at the cabin. At night, when I tried to get water to drink, I felt a cold wind from downstairs. I went out and saw a fire burning below. A black silhouette was walking around the fire, chanting something inaudible. When he saw me, he started running towards me. My heart pounded in my chest as I hid among the logs. After waiting hungry for 3 hours, I finally gathered the courage to run. I ran 5 kilometers through the dark, dense forest, my lungs burning and legs aching, and reached a small settlement a few hours later. I woke up in the early hours of the morning with scratches and bruises everywhere and explained what I had experienced. However, people here said there was nothing there except 2 abandoned huts. When we returned home with the police, we couldn't find any traces. They towed my car, and I took my belongings and left. I wanted to leave these mysterious events behind, but questions about what happened were still floating around in my mind. The eerie silence of the forest, the shadowy figure, and the mysterious happenings would haunt me forever. My friend 25 female from college told me a harrowing story that happened to her and her friends in high school. She is from Buffalo, New York, and often went on camping trips to local upstate campgrounds. When she was a senior, her and 4 of her friends went to a campsite fitted with rows of cabins on the water that people could rent. As the sun went down, the girls noticed that their neighbors a few cabins down, a group of guys similar in age, were playing music and grooving around the campfire, drinking beers. One of the guys asked them all if they wanted to join. When they got over there and started hanging with the guys, everything seemed completely normal, and they were having a fun time. As the night progressed, one of the guys there started to get blackout drunk and eventually pulled out a revolver that he said belonged to his dad. He started waving it around and playing with it. This obviously freaked everyone out, his own friends included. Eventually, he started pointing the gun to his head and laughing, while his friends were yelling at him to put it away and how that wasn't funny. The girls at this point were fairly disturbed and told the guys that they should get back to their cabin and said their goodbyes. When they got back to their cabin, they all talked about how freaky that was and expressed concern for the drunk guy. They then moved on to other topics of conversation and forgot about it for the time being. A few hours later, sometime in the middle of the night, they heard a loud bang coming from the direction of their neighbor's cabin. Shortly after this, a brigade of cop cars showed up to the scene. One officer came to my friend's cabin and started asking them questions about the cabin they visited earlier that night. When my friend asked the officer what happened, he explained that the kid had shot himself in the head in front of his friends. They weren't able to discern if it was act of unaliving thyself or accidental. My friend to this day still has PTSD over this incident and explained that she rarely goes camping anymore. I, 22 female, was 18 years old at that time. In those days, I was a party girl, going out 3 times a week and drinking a lot. That time was wild. I decided to host a party. It was my first party, and I rented a space in my village. It was a cabin on location for events, very cheap for locals. I organized everything with my 18 female best friend, let's call her Marie, and another friend 18 female named Rose. We were having fun decorating and preparing the party. I was so stressed about the party was going to be lame. I decided to cope the stress with alcohol. When the party started and people arrived, I was already tipsy. I invited unrelated people I knew from middle school to high school and some friends I made at college. Even though no one knew anyone, the party was great and people were meeting each other. I had a boyfriend 19 who was coming with his friends. We were around 30. It was late summer, so the weather was mild and most people were outside talking, laughing, and dancing. I had this middle school friend, let's call her Luna, who binged drink and threw up at the entrance of the cabin. She even hurt her foot, and so she had some difficulties to walk. I was at that point drunk, but I wanted to help my friend. I asked her if she wanted to be put to bed, and she said yes. I took her arm and guided her to my house. I live in a small village in the countryside, so it takes less than 5 minutes to get to my house. It was super safe. I used to wander alone in the streets late at night, 1 a.m., 4 a.m. when I had insomnias, and nothing ever happened. It was pitch dark. We were the only ones outside. As we walked, we saw a white SUV, but I didn't think much of it. I came home, gave her some water, and let her sleep in my room. I was alone with my sister that night. I warned her of the presence of my friend and headed back to the party. I was not walking straight, since I was so intoxicated. I saw the white SUV parked near the farm. As I continued walking, a black car stopped next to me and opened its window. I looked at the man. I still don't know what age he was. It was so dark, he said to me, "I've seen this white SUV following you for a while. It is dangerous. You should come to my car." I was drunk, but I directly felt that something was wrong. I just answered that I was okay and my friends were nearby. He insisted. He repeated to come to his car for my safety. My inner alarm went off as I was trying to walk faster and answered again that I was okay. Suddenly, I heard the car's doors opened. He was not alone. I didn't think twice. I just ran for my life. I arrived quickly to the cabin. My friends were all drunk. One of my drunk male friends was complimenting Rose. They saw me coming at them in a hurry. The male friend looked at me and started to compliment me. I told him, "Man, someone tried to abduct me." He stared at me and told me that I shouldn't have left alone, that it was not safe. The party lasted until 4 a.m. People who didn't drink took their car and left. The few others were inside the cabin and started to talk. One of my boyfriend's friends was mad on the Snapchat group because he forgot his knife at the cabin. Why did he carry a knife with him at the party? I told them about what happened, and we were all spooked. After that event, I stopped wandering in the village late at night, but I hosted a few other parties. I have never seen this man and his black car again. Most people keep telling me how great the party was. A couple who met at the party are still together. I still wonder to this day, what would have happened to me if I didn't react that spontaneously. So, for clarification, this was back in 2014. During the summer after The Purge came out, which will be relevant information later. My dad, little brother 11, neighbor 11, and I 15 were staying at a cabin for a week during our summer break to go fishing, etc. On our third night staying there around 11 p.m., some guy comes up and knocks on our door, asking if we could jump his car, because apparently the battery had died while he was driving by. So my dad agreed to help him, but told us to call the cops if he wasn't back in 20 minutes, because our cabin was in the middle of the woods, and he would have had no reason to even be that far down the road, unless he was intentionally on his way to our cabin. 30 minutes pass and my dad gets back, says the guy was asking a bunch of weird questions about how many of us were staying and such, but that he just jump-started his car and the guy left. 2 nights later, my brother, neighbor, and I are up late watching TV in the living room. At some point around 1 a.m., a different guy shows at our cabin wearing the resort's logo and uniform with a resort official car and just stares into our cabin from the porch. He didn't knock or anything, so we have no idea how long he was standing there. But at some point my neighbor had noticed him staring in at us and jumped up and ran over to the bedroom to wake up my dad. So my dad, annoyed at this point, walks up to the door, while not opening it, and asks the guys what he's doing here, and he says he got a call from the reception desk that our TV wasn't working, and he was here to fix it. Meanwhile, our TV was obviously working since he saw us watching stuff on it for who knows how long. Anyways, my dad tells him we don't need anything and he should leave. The guy then proceeds to say we're out of toilet paper and he needs to refill it for us. Again, my dad says we don't need any and that the guy should leave. He continues to get ruder and ruder, asking about towels, our phones, and other stuff he could possibly refill or fix, but eventually leaves. The next morning we call the reception desk to report this because this guy's was obviously out of line. They tell us that they don't send out anyone that late anymore for services for the cabins, and that must have been a mistake. So they ask us to describe the guy, about 55 years old, tall, light blonde and grayish hair, blue eyes, and when we do, they tell us that nobody with that description works there. So at this point we're all extremely freaked out and trying to figure out who the hell he was and why he was there. Turns out that same weekend, there had been hundreds of people across the country attempting to recreate a real-life purge. We don't know for sure if that's what his intentions were, but I'm assuming the first guy, the one with the car problem, asking weird questions, was there to scope out our situation possibly, and when he saw it was just one adult with 3 kids, he relayed it to his partner, the second guy, that we'd be a good cabin to rob, hurt, etc. I'm just happy my dad never unlocked our door for the fake resort guy, cause who knows why he went through all that effort to pretend to work there. Hey guys, so I was reminiscing with my dad about my childhood, and we got to talking about the wooded area around our old neighborhood, now that a good bit of it, not all, but a lot, had been cut down. Some background. I grew up in the southeast U.S. with a very fortunate upbringing. We lived in an upper-class gated community with nothing but doctors, lawyers, and wealthy business people. The neighborhood had 2 gated entrances. The rear entrance had gates that could only be opened via keycard access. The front entrance is where the small security house with 1 or 2 guards on 24/7 duty hung out and let in guests and residents accordingly. However, the rear entrance is where a small but very thickly wooded area ran up against a fence, bordering on the houses that ran alongside it. I'm sure a long time ago, those woods stretched as far as the eye could see, and while there are still an absolute ton of trees in nature there to this day, clearings have since been carved out for small buildings for businesses to go up. It's still a very pretty area, but not the mess of densely wooded vegetation that it used to be. Anyway, one day when we drove back home and went through the rear entrance, me, in all of my childhood wonder and imagination, asked my dad if there was anything in those woods that would be interesting. I wasn't thinking of something scary or creepy, it just held an aura of intrigue for whatever reason. My dad told me that there certainly was. There was a small cabin and shack there near a very, very small swamp that along the aforementioned fence. My dad told me the shack probably went back to the 1800s minimum, certainly around the time of Abraham Lincoln, as he explained it to me then. My mom later laughed at the suggestion, but my dad was serious. Over the next couple of weeks, some of our neighbors backed up his assertion. Nothing creepy or mysterious, just kind of a matter-of-fact thing about the area. So of course one day, I insist we go back there because I wanted to see it for myself. So we take a jog through the neighborhood, open the rear gate on foot with our key card, and dive into the woods. Again, even at this point, it would not be possible to get lost or turned around in these woods. A major road ran next to it on one side and our neighborhood on the other. In terms of width, it was maybe 50-70 yards wide, but likely several football fields in length. No matter what, however, if you kept walking in one direction, you'd eventually reach a road or neighborhood with tons of people within an hour or so getting lost was not a concern. Still, at that time, the woods that were still left untouched were positively thick. There was no beaten path, roots, and uneven terrain everywhere. It was difficult to walk through without tripping over yourself, and walking in a straight line was near impossible. It was only about 15 minutes after entering the woods that we stumbled across it, and I discovered that my dad wasn't exaggerating. There, in the middle of all the brush, was a tiny, one-room dilapidated shack, somehow still standing. Even in the middle of the afternoon, it looked absolutely creepy. You could tell just by looking at it that this thing was old, certainly something that was used by an outdoorsman or something similar over a century ago. We walked around it, and although there was nothing remarkable about it other than its age, it just seemed to have this aura of something that had so many stories to tell. The single door on the shack was only half standing and half intact. It looked as though it had been cut in half vertically, so you could see inside it somewhat from the outside. We walked up to it, and my dad gently pulled open what remained of the door. Inside was an old lantern and one of those old-time stoves. About 10 yards from the shack was the again, very small swamp I mentioned earlier. Right on the bank of this swamp was an equally old rowboat, now broken in half almost exactly at the middle, most of it having practically fused with the mixture of soil, mud, and water it sat on. I seem to remember moss had overtaken a lot of it, so much so that it would be easy to overlook as a log or fallen tree from a distance. So we stood there and walked around the area, my dad telling me of his best guesses of how old this thing was, what it was used for, etc. Not just his guesses either, the general consensus of other adults who had lived in the area for some time. People knew that not all that long ago, before the area started being deforested and roads paved and whatever, coyotes and the like were native to it. Anyway, as we hung around the area, suddenly we hear a sort of clang from the shack. It was loud and reverberated through the woods. It spooked both of us. We glanced over at the shack, and a small piece of wood from the roof had fallen off and landed on the stove. We laughed uneasily, but took it as a sign to turn around and go home. I suppose we felt kind of bad that disturbing this ancient shack ever so slightly had apparently almost caused the thing to collapse, which would be a shame. Although there is no ghost story here or anything, it was something in my mind I will never forget. It was an honest, mysterious piece of history just sitting there in what remained of some woods, bordering on a modern upper-class neighborhood and a major busy road. How many people drove by that area, completely oblivious to this small thing that had been there for a century or longer? Who lived there? What was the area like back then? What was the purpose of the shack? How long was it used? What stories did that thing have to tell? In recent years, most of those woods have been chopped down in sections. There is still an absolute ton of nature in the area, and it's still gorgeous to this day. but I was disappointed when I drove by a couple years ago and saw that the particular area where this shack once sat was now gone. The swamp converted into a sort of artificial lake from what I could tell, complete with fountain in the middle and a few of the trees still surrounding it. I wonder what they did with the shack, the stove still inhabiting it, and the beached rowboat. I can't imagine the stove in particular would have been just tossed away. It was hard evidence that this small little shack was a piece of some unknown history when the United States was either in its youth or perhaps not even an independent nation yet. Really wish I could go back there now and see it again. Alas, all I have is this memory.
Thanks for listening. If you like our work, do subscribe because your support helps us keep this channel alive.